The problem is also that intellectual critics themselves use cliches all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's okay and it's important to critique harmful cliches, obviously. Just don't assume that if you preach against them, they'll be gone, as if there was some kind of pure language degenerated and we should only be critical to redeem it or something. And don't assume you don't use cliches yourself, because no one is always original, right?
Exactly. No one is always original.
So the other day, after I complained to a friend about working too hard, he told me, well, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I immediately thought two things. First, it really isn't true. What doesn't kill you can definitely make you weaker, right?
Right.
And second, it's actually a quote from Nietzsche, but no one remembers that because it's become a cliche. And cliches are ownerless. They belong to no one and to everyone at the same time. And I guess that's what makes them so powerful and suggestive in a way. They become part of this shared communal pool. And this is where their authority comes from. They sound like collective wisdom. So what's the biggest cliche of your week?
I'm not sure it's the biggest cliche. It's more like a literary reference I stumbled on this week. It's from Doris Lessing's The Four-Gated City. There's a line where the protagonist talks about her disdain for everything that is new, and she says, just a minute. She says, I want to take words as ordinary as bread or life or death, cliches. I want to have my nose rubbed in cliches. And she describes her affection to cliches in physical, almost sensual terms. She wants her nose rubbed in them. And a few lines earlier, she even says, I want to be sunk in the obvious. Isn't that beautiful? It's so evocative of so many things we've talked about.
I really like this image of wanting to plunge into the obvious. But I think, as we know, this positive attitude to cliches is really unusual because what we usually see is harsh rejection of cliches, right? Now, maybe that's changing today, and maybe we'll get to that later, but ever since the term cliché emerged in the 19th century, it mostly meant something bad. It's always something you attribute to others, almost never to yourself, right? And when you stumble on a cliché, you feel this negativity in your body. It's like this fatigue and cringe, the sense of, here we go again. There's this distinct affect to cliché exhaustion, right? So I'd really like us to talk about why we're so afraid of them.
I think that the historical moment when the term cliché enters language gives us a really good starting point for thinking about that fear, maybe even panic.
Yeah, panic, I think, is the word.
Yeah, because using a cliché starts to signal the exact opposite of what modernity demands from a human being. That is, it signals not thinking for yourself, not relying on your own mind or creative powers, but falling back on something ready-made, something already worn thin.
Which, by the way, in antiquity and for most of history, wasn't such a big deal. I mean, repeating tropes and topoi was even part of proper education, right? Yeah.
Although, remember that Plato already warned us against too popular ideas.
Right.
But I think the difference is that in modernity, clichés become an example of a deeper fear, that if you're not careful, your thinking can be hijacked by ready-made ideas that circulate everywhere. The risk of losing your individuality and originality, being swept into a faceless, nameless crowd. And that's genuinely terrifying.
And we know that this fear actually has roots in the word cliché itself, because originally the word cliché referred to a physical printing instrument, a stencil. So the word comes from the click or klitz sound of the molten lead that created the print pattern, the printing plate. And this printing pattern allowed the rapid reproduction of identical text. And then over time, the technology produced this inflation of texts with repeating patterns, and the word cliché was borrowed to describe trite or banal language.
And all this happens exactly when originality becomes not just a value, but a demand.
Exactly.
You have to be original to count as a worthy human being.
This is such a paradox because modern people are expected to use technologies of reproduction, right? Like rapid print. But they're also expected to somehow remain completely original. Like you have to use clichés, but you can't become one. And I think this is an impossible demand, and it creates this constant tension and this constant anxiety about seeming banal. And you can really see this anxiety in late 19th century works. Like a very famous one is Flaubert with his famous Dictionary of Accepted Ideas, which is basically an early cliché dictionary. And today we can see many such online lists of forbidden clichés, in movies, sports, etc. So I think that's one reason for the fear. Too many people suddenly reading and writing and expressing themselves publicly, and the danger that clichés make us less original and less creative. But sometimes there are also, I think, better or deeper reasons to be afraid of clichés, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's where our fear of clichés turn into a moral accusation. Clichés aren't just stylistically bad, they're treated as ethically bad.
Yeah, they're like dangerous.
Right. And one of the most striking examples of this appears in Hannah Arendt's analysis of Adolf Eichmann.
Yeah.
She again and again points out his language as saturated with clichés, stock phrases, formulas, ready-made expressions. But her point isn't just linguistics, and that's the main idea. For her, his clichés reflect a deeper failure, the failure of a mind unable to think for itself. So she actually suggests that Eichmann committed his crimes in part because of his use of language. His clichés didn't just express his thoughtlessness, they enabled it.
Yeah, I think that in that sense, the Eichmann trial becomes a trial against clichés themselves, in a way, right? It's not just the execution of a Nazi, but a call to execute clichés, to really eradicate them from language. And we know that this approach isn't unique to Arendt, right? It's pretty common among scholars, artists, critics. Roland Barthes is a typical example, but there are many others also today who treat clichés almost as a crime, and sometimes, as in this case, even a crime against humanity, right? So cliché users aren't just seen as lazy or stupid, but as dangerous, because clichés can spread harmful ideologies without reflection.
And this is so interesting. Although a cliché is weak, empty, and obvious, something that has lost its original force, it can still be powerful and dangerous.
Yeah, that's the paradox. I think that its emptiness makes it available for harmful exploitation. Its weakness in this sense is its strength. So stating the obvious may sound naive, right? But it can be dangerous because it doesn't allow us to think critically about what we say. And sometimes what sounds obvious is harmful or just not true. So I think this kind of critique that we all know is very powerful, and often it's very convincing. But as some have noticed, criticizing clichés is itself often cliched, right? It's very banal to critique the clichés of others and search after the hidden ideologies behind clichés. But more crucially, the question is, I think, if this fantasy of getting rid of all cliches even possible? Can we have a cliché-less language? I think that maybe before we can even answer that, we really need to take a step back and ask, what is a cliché? Because I think and I feel that sometimes critics take for granted what counts as a cliché, and then they end up, like criticizing something they have not clearly defined.
I agree. Before deciding whether cliches are dangerous or not, or whether we can eliminate them from language, we need to understand what they are. And almost all definitions start from repetition. A cliche is supposed to be a phrase repeated too many times. It was once fresh, and now it's worn out. And this is right, but only up to a point.
Yeah, because if repetition were enough, we'd have a problem, because language is full of repetition, right? And not everything repeated becomes a cliche.
Exactly. Think about everyday phrases. Have a nice day.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Endless repetition, but we don't usually experience them as cliches. Or think about prayers, love letters, literary lines which were quoted word for word, repeated across generations, and still are not dead. They're alive to us. And slurs. How about shit? Is shit a cliche? A cliche? Do you
I
think?
don't know. Well, it's definitely repeated, but no, I wouldn't call it a cliche, I think.
And meanwhile, tomorrow is another day, a much less repeated phrase, is considered a paradigmatic example of a cliche.
Yeah, and take have a nice day, which is much more repeated and is not necessarily a cliche, right? So
exactly. So what we see is that repetition alone can't be the whole story of a cliche. Something else has to happen here.
yeah, and I think that something else isn't embedded in the phrase itself. It's about our interpretation, right? So a cliche is something that seems, sounds, feels over-repeated, like a déjà vu. And it feels repeated even if it hasn't actually been repeated that much.
Which raises the real question, what makes something feel overfamiliar? We know that certain grammatical structures are typical of cliches. For example, it's not the X, it's the Y.
Yeah.
For example, it's not about the money, it's about the principle. It's not what you say, it's how you say it.
It's not the heat, it's the humidity, right? Or it's not you, it's me.
Right. And when those structures appear, even in new sentences, it can still sound cliched.
But give an example if
So
you have one.
maybe like, it's not the silence, it's the pause.
Okay, sounds a cliche to me.
It's not the distance, it's the delay.
You're good, Dana.
Yeah. So we haven't heard them before, but they still sound like cliches.
I think that that's one case, but maybe the most interesting case is when contexts make something feel cliche. When we expect cliches, we hear them everywhere. And actually, I think that was in part the case with Eichmann, right?
I agree. And Arendt also agrees. And she notices that some of his cliches are actually made up by him. She calls it his made-up cliches. They really haven't been repeated ever. And what is fascinating is that we see almost the opposite dynamic in The Truman Show, the movie. Truman, as we remember, lives inside a completely staged reality without knowing it. And he really does repeat certain phrases over and over, like the famous good morning, and in case I don't see a good afternoon.
Good evening and good night, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And these phrases genuinely do become worn out through repetition. They turn into cliches. But in the final scene, as Truman steps out of that stage world, he again repeats that same catchphrase one last time. And suddenly, it no longer feels empty.
Right.
In that context, the phrase regains meaning. The cliche doesn't disappear. It stays a cliche. It's still worn out, but also it's transformed in some way.
Yeah, I think this shows something really crucial, that even genuinely over-repeated cliches can become meaningful again in the right context.
Yes, what matters isn't repetition alone, but context. How, when, and by whom something is said, and how it's heard. And we just gave examples of two kinds of cliches that wouldn't traditionally count as cliches at all. Eichmann's new cliches and Truman's reclaimed or renovated cliches.
Yeah.
Neither are just a matter of mechanical repetition.
Okay, so if cliches are so radically dependent on context, I think this brings us back to the question of whether we can get rid of them at all. Because it wouldn't work to make a list of forbidden cliches and preach against them, right? As many people have tried. Because what matters is how people use and interpret them in specific situations. And often, I also must add, critics of cliches are extremely patronizing towards supposedly simple-minded cliche-using people. And very often, that critique is aimed specifically at less educated classes.
Yes, and that snobbery isn't the only problem. The problem is also that intellectual critics themselves use cliches all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's okay and it's important to critique harmful cliches, obviously. Just don't assume that if you preach against them, they'll be gone, as if there was some kind of pure language degenerated and we should only be critical to redeem it or something. And don't assume you don't use cliches yourself, because no one is always original, right?
Exactly. No one is always original.
And that's why I think so many people feel the need to signal their awareness and say things like, I know it's cliche, but, right? Or it's a cliche,
but it's
true.
true.
Yeah. And speaking of admitted cliches, right? Maybe I think this is a good moment to address the elephant in the room. You and I are obviously not native English speakers, although you did grow up in LA and absorbed English from childhood, and I lived for a while in the US. So do you feel, as a non-native speaker, you're more prone to cliches, or maybe the opposite, a better critic of them?
It's a good question. I think that being a cliche means being marked as a cliche. So to detect that marking, you really have to be socially and culturally intimate with the language on the one hand, but also not too close as to not notice them. So to use cliches fluently, to be a cliche speaker, to play with them, subvert them, reclaim them, you need a very deep familiarity with language. And what that means is that cliches don't necessarily signal linguistic poverty at all. And I might even venture to say that knowing a language is, in an important sense, knowing its cliches, knowing what sounds over-familiar, what feels like it's already been said too many times.
Yeah, I generally agree, but I think that as a non-native speaker who doesn't have total familiarity with English, I sometimes notice cliches that native speakers don't, or at least I felt that way when I lived in the US. So I think using cliches means being really immersed in what everyone says to such an extent that you stop noticing them. And being an outsider can let you question what everyone takes for granted. I think it reminds me of something else. I recently watched the Apple TV series Pluribus, where almost all the humanity becomes a kind of a hive mind, and only the hair one, who is the legendary Rhea Seahorn, and a few others, they retain their independent thinking. And the series isn't one-dimensional about which option is better. And I immediately thought about us and about cliches, because cliches help people function together as a hive mind, especially in rituals, ceremonies, moments that require communality, right? They smooth communication, they save effort, they save time, they reduce friction. And the show even suggests that this synchronized kind of thinking reduces violence and tension, and also it just very plainly reduces waste. It's more ecological in that sense. So it's no wonder we talk about, I think, recycled language when we talk about cliches. They're economical. And still, I suppose most viewers of the show end up feeling it's better to be an original, independent thinker, even if you are an asshole like her, than to live through cliches.
Yes, and I think it's no coincidence that one of the harshest critics of cliches was also a great theorist of mind control.
Orwell?
Exactly, George Orwell, which in his novel 1984, cliches are an important part of what makes independent thinking almost impossible.
Yeah.
They're one of the main tactics of brainwashing. So just to be clear, we're not claiming that cliches have suddenly become exciting, original, or liberating forms of speech.
No.
And we're definitely not trying to rehabilitate them or to pretend they're something that they're not. But at the same time, we don't want to automatically blame them.
Exactly.
So rather than treating cliches only as a moral failure or as a cognitive danger, we want to look at them as they actually are, part of our linguistic and cultural habitat. Instead of asking only how to eliminate cliches, we ask what they do without assuming in advance that they're either harmful or helpful.
Yeah, I agree, but I think there's also still a tension here because until recently, cliché was bad by definition. I mean, not just familiar or formulaic, but annoying, unwanted, right? But I think that lately it is changing in a way. So take, for example, Taylor Swift, who's often accused of being cliché, right? She has started to say things like cliches are awesome. And also in pop culture more broadly, being unique seems to be less and less important than being, for example, relatable or repeating familiar tropes and trends. And this is very different from earlier ironic or this campy tendency to mock people who use cliches seriously. So now it seems that cliches are gradually being embraced and even celebrated sometimes.
There's even a holiday in the United States, November 3rd. It's called Cliché Day, and it's a day dedicated for celebrating the joys of cliché.
I know because it's my partner's birthday. I don't lucky him or the opposite. I don't know. Yeah. But what happens here? I mean, does the word cliché itself change its meaning? How do we understand this shift? Is it this kind of fatigue of being original after COVID and wars and constant disruption, this feeling that history repeats itself or something like that? Or is the ideal of originality changing in a culture that increasingly relies on algorithms? What's going on here?
I think a part of it has to do with social media and especially with participatory culture. Because to participate today often means to redo something, to repost, retweet, reshare, remix, recaption, to repeat.
Yeah.
So participation itself is built on repetition. And once repetition becomes the basic mode of participation, it stops feeling so threatening. It's no longer the opposite of originality. It's simply how you show up. You don't have to invent something entirely new every time. You repeat, tweak, recontextualize.
And repetition is clearly encouraged by the algorithms, right?
I'm reminded of a moment in class a few years ago. I gave my students a logic assignment, and one student posted her full answers on the course form.
Okay.
And when I asked her why she did that, she genuinely didn't understand the problem.
No,
she
seriously?
said, yeah, I was just sharing. And she wasn't being rebellious. She was acting according to a different logic. If you have something, share it. It's circulation. It's contribution.
Clichés have special roles within this logic, right? Because they have no copyright. Clichés subvert the idea that language is property, which since modernity, this idea seems like a law of nature, right? That language belongs to someone. But no, I'm not implying that we should all embrace clichés and give up copyright or something. we can paraphrase one of the biggest cliches of our time. If you use cliches for free, you are the product, right? But something about this era doesn't just encourage cliches, it seems to be legitimizing them.
That's so interesting. Ownerless language, that's what you said. That's exactly ChatGPT, isn't it? It's actually a very good description of it.
Yeah, and large language models in general, right? Yeah, AI systems are built on statistical probabilities of how sentences tend to continue, right? Based on a huge amount of existing language. So in that sense, their language really is everybody's. But for that reason, it's also completely anonymous. It doesn't belong to anyone in particular, although it does belong to the corporates, right, who manage the platforms.
Then AI language is literally repetitive. So it's not surprising that some critics say that this is just a machine that produces cliches. Yeah. Isn't AI language basically a giant cliche generator?
Yeah, I think although, as we said earlier, cliches are not necessarily repetitive, some of them are. And we can even say that some cliches work like algorithms, like machines for producing sentences through repetition probabilities. So, I don't know, if I say something like, love is, you're probably going to continue with...
Pink and sticky.
Okay, no, think you're a chatbot, right? So love is...
Okay, blind.
Obviously, right? Because although we have so many other options, love is all you need, or love is all there is, or much less idiomatic options such as, well, I don't know.
Love is overrated.
Okay. Or love is a sandwich, or love is pink, for that matter. So
and sticky.
And sticky. Okay, so cliches are not a coincidental byproduct of AI. It's built in the technology, and that's why so many people feel chatbots produce so many cliches. Now, AI architects, as we know, try to reduce them. But will a chatbot that doesn't use cliches at all sound necessarily more human?
Definitely not. A chatbot that doesn't use cliches at all would sound strange. Humans use cliches a lot.
Yeah.
And the absence of cliches wouldn't make an AI sound more human. It would make it sound less so. Because human language exists somewhere in between repetition and invention, familiarity and originalities.
Yeah.
And clichés are a part of this balance. Without them, language stops sounding like something people would actually say.
I think what you say also makes me think about authenticity, right? Is the use of clichés an expression of authenticity or of inauthenticity? I mean, clichés are often seen as inauthentic because you're not really using your own words and utterances, but parroting others or just repeating a generally accepted opinion. So if you say things like, I don't know, there's no place like home, or you just write a story with a cheesy happy ending, or you do an overused TikTok dance, because we know cliches are not only verbal, but they can also be visual. So it doesn't really feel like you. And yet, cliches can also be the most authentic expression because it is so human, as you said, and it is so genuine to be immersed in what others do. That's why, as you said, I think that to speak fluent humanish, AI can't get rid of cliches altogether.
And why should it? The fact is that authentic human speakers use cliches.
Yeah, that's why I think there's no incentive for AI companies to really completely eliminate the chatbot's cliches. And not only because of the tendency we know of enshittification, like the tendency to make the platforms worse.
Yes.
But it's because, to use another cliche, cliches are not a bug, they're a feature. To be human isn't only to be original, it's also to be cliche. Which is why this AI moment we're in lets us really rethink what it means to be human. And also realize we're in many ways imitation and copy machines, and have always been. We are a mimetic species. And copying is, by the way, also related to copia, which is in Latin abundance, taking part in a shared communal reservoir. And I always ask myself whether there's a real way to reconcile with this. Because frankly, I think I dwell personally on these thoughts because admitting the parts of me that are cliché is not always easy for me. What about you?
I identify deeply with Doris Lessing. I, like her, many times wish to be sunk in the obvious. And I've always been drawn to cliches, other people's, but also my own. And honestly, without much shame. Words aren't like precious stones. Scarcity doesn't work the same way in language. But you're right about the idea of admission, because I think that I don't mind admitting my cliches because I feel I can choose them. I don't feel like they're forced on me. And that means that I'm speaking from a position of privilege.
Yeah, but I think the thing is, the assumption that some people are naive cliche users who can't choose and others, like you, for example, are critical and self-aware and can choose, I think it's not very accurate because people accused of using certain cliches, let's take, I don't know, a typical lower middle class or spiritual cliche like everything happens for a reason, right? So those same people can be very sharp critics of intellectual cliches. But I'm not implying here some kind of a relativist position where all cliches are equal. Some are more harmful than others. Obviously, racist and Nazi cliches are worse than just saying something like, everything happens for a reason, right? But I don't think it's very common to find a cliche user who isn't aware of the cliches of others. Mm-hmm. I think most of us, most of the time, are in some kind of undetermined space. We use cliches and apologize for using them. We say something and are not sure whether it's a cliche or not. Or we use cliches we know are cliches but still choose them. So these transitional zones are what interests me the most, not the typical parody and irony that mock cliches.
I agree. The transitional zones are the interesting ones. And that's where cliches we live by exist.
Okay, so maybe it's time to sign off with that. Everybody has a podcast, and now we have one too.
We're special.
Like everybody else.